The District Attorney of Philadelphia represents the city's government in the prosecution of criminal offenses. They are the chief law enforcement and legal officer for the city. The district attorney's role is to lead the prosecution of individuals suspected with committing a crime. They have the power to direct criminal investigations, recommend sentencing for those who are convicted, and is the only attorney who participates in grand jury proceedings. Furthermore, the DA recommends what charges should be made against the accused. This elected official's views on such subjects as illegal drug use, the death penalty, and the role of the police in how to enforce the law will have a direct impact on the lives of us all. The candidates for District Attorney of Philadelphia, they are here today to share with you their views on a number of issues affecting our community today and how they will fulfill their commitment to serve and protect all Philadelphians. So before I invite the candidates who showed up to the table, I just want to let you know that we invited all of the district attorney candidates to be here tonight. 6 of them committed to coming. Only 2 of them are here. Now, fortunately for us, that means that we get to go in and go deep with the candidates who are actually here, right? So without further ado, I would like to invite the candidates for the office of District Attorney to the table, please. Okay, so what we'll have now is we'll have an opportunity for the 2 DA candidates to briefly introduce yourselves. You'll have about, it was originally supposed to be 30 seconds, but since we have all this free time now, I'll give you a minute to introduce yourselves. Let's start with.
Sure. Okay. It's okay if I stand? Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay. So my name is Joe Kahn. In 60 seconds, I'm running for district attorney because I'm a lifelong Philadelphian. I'm a product of Philadelphia Public Schools. I'm the son of a Muslim immigrant who was able to come to this country at a time that we didn't have a president who was scapegoating people who looked and worshiped as he did. I am a public servant who has dedicated his entire adult life to seeking justice in Philadelphia. And for me, that was being a champion and an advocate for victims of sexual assault, child abuse, and domestic violence for 6 years as an assistant district attorney here in Philadelphia. And then for 10 years at the United States Attorney's Office, where in addition to learning how to take on tough fights, we took on much larger fights, big fights that can only be solved with the power of a government institution like a prosecutor's office that can deal with major social problems like gun violence, like fraud against the elderly, like human trafficking. And understanding that the role of the prosecutor is not simply to get convictions, but to seek justice in the most expansive way possible. And as your district attorney, that will be my commitment to you, is to seek justice for all Philadelphians and for all families in Philadelphia. Because in addition to being a public servant, I'm a father of 2 young children who I think deserve, as all children in the city do, to be safe and to be treated fairly by our government. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Larry Krasner. I'm number 57 on the ballot. I'm running for district attorney. I think it's kind of fitting that we're in this particular building because there is quite a history having to do with stepping on the necks of certain people and others who got up and tried to do something about it, and some of that history is in this room. And sadly, we find ourselves in 2017 with some pretty similar issues going on in our criminal justice system that require transformational, fundamental change, not just changing a few things. There's a lot of things have to be changed with our criminal justice system in this, the most incarcerated nation in the world, in this country, where we find that there are more people of color in custody than were in slavery at the beginning of the Civil War. Hopefully we'll get to talk about that tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for those introductions and also for following our time guidelines. I hope you will continue to do so this evening. That was a joke. Thank you. So before I get into my round of questions, I would like to invite one of our co-sponsors for this evening from Witness to Hunger to offer a testimony and also to ask our first question for the evening. Are you? Is that you? That's you? Okay. Okay.
Hi, I'm Angela Nike Sutton. I'm from Witnesses to Hunger. Our organization fights against hunger and poverty and all injustices that we see. What we do is we take photographs of what poverty looks like in Philadelphia and surrounding cities. And what we do is we go to the Capitol, we go to legislators, we go to policymakers, and we teach them that we are more than just a number. So when they're making these cuts and when they're making these decisions based off of the safety net, what we do is show them that we are human, we are here, and we're not going anywhere. We fight for all the people that don't have a voice. We empower people that to have a voice that feel like they're voiceless. And now that we're trying to get into our own organization, we want all of y'all to understand we are the community. We vote these people in, and it's our job to hold them accountable. We are their boss. If we don't like what we see, we must impeach people. We must get people put out of office. So that's what our organization does. We are a movement of caregivers and parents who love our children, and we're going to stop the generational cycle of poverty, hunger, and injustice to all communities. I have a couple of questions, but since it's only y'all two here, and I thank you for coming, because it does mean a lot, because for you to want to be a DA and the attack that all colored people are under right now, for y'all to show up means a great deal to colored people all around, because we know that we are under attack, and they're trying to bring back modern day slavery. The prison line, the school pipeline is real. Gentrification is real. We know what's going on. We understand that they're making money off of low-income people, off of the backs of us. They still want free labor. A lot of us don't have knowledge of self, but with people like us in our organization, and hopefully the next DA, we can work together to show that we are not tolerating it and we're not going to stand for it. My question is, what is your understanding of the current administration's approach to the policies, especially in low-income areas and areas occupied by people of color, and how does it influence your approach to this work? And what are you going to do to change what you see, any injustice it is, and how can we hold you accountable?
So if I may just slide in really quickly, if you can answer the first part of that question, because we'll get to some of those other more tangible things at the end. But could you repeat the first part of that so we're clear? The part about the administration's policy and that part?
Okay. What is your understanding of the current administration's approach to policies, especially in the low-income areas and the areas occupied by people of color?
So you'll have 2 minutes to respond to that question.
So thank you so much for your question. There's a lot more than I can cover in 2 minutes, so let me try and break off a piece of that in terms of one specific area of policies where we see, number one, policies that I think need to be changed and policies that disproportionately affect communities of color. We can talk about how the current administration, we're talking about the current district attorney's office, is dealing with addiction, okay? Now, as many of you who have heard me speak before know, I never met either of my grandfathers. The reason I never met my mother's father is because he died when she was 10 years old because he lost his fight with addiction. And I have watched for years, as all of us have, our criminal justice system continue to treat addiction like a crime. right? It's why I have called for an end for the prosecution of the lowest level drug offenses where people's only crime is not dealing drugs, is having drugs that they intend to consume. I'm not talking about just some drugs. I'm talking about involving these cases in the criminal justice system when we have a public health problem. Now, one of the many problems with our current approach is that it disproportionately affects communities of color, okay? So a person who is living in a rich neighborhood, right, may not be caught for possessing drugs, but a person from a poor neighborhood, a person of color, may be much more likely to be caught, right? And these are things that an individual prosecutor can fix by him or herself. We need a district attorney who's willing to stand up and take a leadership role in this. So that's why what I want to do is make sure that when we're dealing with this issue of addiction in particular, that we focus on providing treatment not after we have an arrest, not after we've devoted resources that should be being put into treatment, that are going to court costs and going to having an ADA and having lawyers involved. I want to make sure we take that out of the criminal justice system, not only because it's more likely to get a person who is suffering from addiction help, but it is less likely to have that person result in having a criminal record, which can make it more difficult to recover, more difficult to move on with their lives, more difficult to do things that people need to do when they're in recovery.
Excuse me, if I may, I just want to remind us that we are broadcasting live on WURD. So that last speaker was candidate Joe Kahn. And if you can just identify yourself before speaking, that would be wonderful.
Excuse me, Larry Krasner again. So I took the question to be a question, and perhaps I misunderstood, but I thought it was a question about race and a question that was about systems, procedures, policies, and their impact. So this is what I see. I see a police department here and elsewhere that engages in systemically racist enforcement by focusing on certain neighborhoods and not focusing on others. And I see a court system that is also systemically racist. And we see that when there are studies of what happens with the district attorney's office, for example, in New York, and we see differences in sentencing that can only be attributed to factors that are racial. I see this as being part of, frankly, a larger picture as well, and that is a picture of one policy after another that involves stepping on the necks of the poor, and therefore, in a highly discriminatory fashion, stepping on the necks of colored people. You see it with the death penalty, which is extremely racist in application and detrimental. You see it with mass incarceration. You have to stop seeking the death penalty. You have to push against mass incarceration. You see it with cash bail, which overwhelmingly is detrimental to the poor and people of color. You have to end cash bail and go with a better system. And you see it with civil asset forfeiture, where we are taking the assets of poor people who can't defend those assets, and we're doing so in a way that is extremely discriminatory. There's a common thread here, and the common thread that runs through is we are stepping on the necks of the poor, and that in turn is stepping on the necks of people of color. It's been going on for a very long time, and fortunately we're at a point in history when people are ready to go a different direction, and that is where I'd like to go.
So I would like to give Joe Kahn an opportunity to explicitly address race and class and how you understand the role of race and class in the criminal justice system, in policing. You can respond directly.
2 minutes or?
No, 1 minute, please.
1 minute, okay. Right. So in 1 minute, and let's state clearly, because we need a district attorney who is going to not just acknowledge, but be vigilant about the fact that there is systemic racism in this country that infects the criminal justice system. And I give the example of addiction as just one of many things, and Larry is right. All of these areas are areas where we need reform, and these aren't just reforms that we need to talk about, and every single one down the list, civil asset forfeiture, bail reform. These are things where I can speak not just in terms of what I want to do, but what I have done and what we need to finally do in the local system. So let's talk about, for example, bail. I think that's the best example you can look at, where we have criminalized poverty, right? We have people that are sitting in jail cells in Philadelphia, in county jails, right? Not because they're dangerous, not because they're a flight risk, not because they've been convicted of a crime, but because they are poor. Now, when I left the district attorney's office and I became an assistant U.S. attorney, we had a completely different system. And in every single case that I handled for 10 years, not once did a person sit in jail because they were poor. Not once did a person sit in jail where they hadn't been convicted, they weren't dangerous, and they were too much of a flight risk. We didn't set some arbitrary number and say, listen, we'll see if you can make your bail, and if you can't, you'll sit and rot and lose your job, and your family won't see you until you get out. That's not the kind of system that I worked in, and that's not the kind of system we should tolerate anymore, and that's the kind of reforms that we're going to have when I'm district attorney. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for those responses. It's very helpful for us to have a better sense of your worldview, right? Because these are among the things that will inform the kind of work you would do in the office of the district attorney. So I want to make a brief comment to the organizers. I received a text that our Facebook live stream is down. I'm not sure who is in charge of that, but if we can get that up and running, I think it's very important that people who are not here have access to this conversation. So, I would like to shift gears a little bit. The next couple of questions is intending to get at our candidates' perspectives on changes in the federal and state policy climate related to policing and prosecution. So my first question, and you will have a minute to respond each. Nationally, the Justice Department is instructing federal prosecutors to pursue maximum charges for crimes. What is your stance on prosecuting low-level drug offenders and other misdemeanors? If your stance is different from this pursuit of maximum charges, what kind of programs do you support, and what kind of alternatives to harsh sentencing do you support, if any? So why don't we start with Larry Krasner first?
Okay, so this is Larry Krasner. We have a memo from Jeff Sessions saying all of that stuff that Eric Holder and Barack Obama did is off the table. There will be no more balance anymore. Go for the biggest charges and go for the biggest sentences because the war on drugs worked so well the first time. We need to bring it right back. Wow. That's what you're dealing with. What he is saying is the absolute antithesis, the absolute opposite of what I have been saying in this campaign, what I've believed for the longest time. The war on drugs was a disaster, and if we are to talk about what should be done with people who are addicted, well, the answer is they should not be convicted. They should be treated because they have a medical condition. They are not a crime. They are people with a medical condition. Now, I do have a slightly different view, I think, than you'll probably hear from Mr. Khan, having actually worked with addicts for 30 years as a defense attorney and a civil rights attorney. And that attitude is that you use the process to take people who have severe addictions and to pressure them into getting that treatment. But at the end of the day, I want no convictions for addicts. I just want them to get the help they need.
This is Joe Kahn. Yeah, we do disagree. I don't think that we should continue to use the pressures of the system because what that means, what that pressure means, is jail time if this doesn't work out. And I know from experience, not just from 16 years as a prosecutor working with these folks, whether they are my defendants or my witnesses, as the majority of my victims in the sexual assault prosecutions that I handled were, that folks don't necessarily beat their habit the first or second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth or ninth or 10th times that they try. And having this system where people are put on probation and they violate their probation again and again and again, and we're involving a court system, we are taking resources away that could be better used for treatment. So what have we tried under our current police commissioner? Well, there is a program that started after I called for something that looks just like this, because they've been doing this in other cities. In 2 of the police districts in Philadelphia, the 22nd and 39th, they've been trying to have law enforcement assisted diversion, where when they intervene in a drug deal, they arrest the dealer, they take the addict to a local treatment center, they don't charge them, they don't bring the system. I think that's the way to go. I think it's fair and it's right.
Thank you for those responses. So I'd like to shift to the state level. So you may or may not be aware, and I'm talking to the people gathered here, that the PA State Senate just this week passed legislation to restrict public access to video recorded using police body cameras. Before this, the Pennsylvania State Senate also passed a bill that was later vetoed to not require the names of officers involved in officer-involved shootings to be made public. My question to our candidates here is, what is your stance on public access to the names of police officers in video recorded by police officers in officer-involved shootings? So you'll have also a minute to respond to this. Let's start with Joe Kahn.
So the common thread between both of these questions concerns transparency. Okay, this concerns taxpayers, the public's right to know what their public servants, the police, the district attorney's office are doing. And I favor transparency. Now, there are two specific bills here. The first bill concerns the release of police officers' names. And what the bill, which was completely wrongheaded, put forward by Republicans in Harrisburg was to restrict the ability of local police departments, like our police department here in Philadelphia, to decide when to turn over that information. Now, there's no reason to tie the hands of local police departments in releasing information to the public. This is a ridiculous rule. It is a solution in search of a problem, and all it does is create distrust between law enforcement and the communities. I completely oppose this Republican effort. The other issue in terms of body cameras is we want to make sure that we are being transparent. Now, we certainly don't want to create a situation where if the police arrive to your home for a domestic disturbance, that your personal privacy is being intruded upon. But when we're talking about an officer shooting, and there are facts that are important for the public to know about, we absolutely have to have a process where the public gets to know what happened, if there are charges brought, and if they're not, why they were not brought.
Larry Krasner again. I agree. I agree with all of that. Transparency is a real good thing. But it is, of course, indicative of how our system really works that anyone would think it actually made sense to pass a law that says law enforcement officers who are paid with tax dollars that are paid by us and who work for us in their public capacity can hide their names when no other citizen can do so. I mean, that really does give you a window on how certain people think about this whole situation. As for the body cameras, I have always believed that video evidence is some of the most truthful and most important evidence that there is. And in handling over 10,000 cases and being in court 4 to 5 days a week for 30 years, I've tried a lot of cases involving video of police when they are, for example, in the Eskia Sabur case, unmercifully beating someone without justification. This will not solve all problems, trust me. But the beauty of technology right now is, as you can see around this room, everyone has a cell phone. And for the first time, we have a great equalizer where citizens can actually take video as well, and it is helping us to get at the truth.
Thank you for those responses. So we're going to change the pace just a tiny bit. What is going to happen now is we are going to have a round of rapid response questions. They were originally designed to be yes/no questions because we anticipated having 6 candidates at the table. But since they are not here, I'm going to ask you to say yes or no, and then you will have the opportunity to add, if you want to, a brief 15 to 20 second response to the series of questions I'm going to ask. Is that clear? Great. So the first question. Some district attorneys choose to open an independent review board to investigate wrongdoing by police officers in the departments that they work in. Would you commission an independent review board of the police if you were elected? Let's start with, who did we start with last time? Okay, let's start with Larry Krasner.
Short answer, yes, but having done 75 plus civil rights lawsuits myself, and having acted honestly as about the only real prosecutor for police brutality in this city, where the DA does no such thing, I'd like them under my oversight rather than under the oversight of someone who lacks that experience.
So my answer is actually no, because I don't want a board. I actually want independent review, period. I don't want someone reviewing the district attorney's handling of police officers that he or she works with every day. I want to have this entire process handled independently by an outside prosecutor, I think it is long overdue for us to recognize that for police shootings, police misconducts, we can't have a process anymore that people don't trust. And that's why I don't just want a board to review it. I want the process itself to get it right from the beginning.
Thank you. That was Joe Kahn, and Joe Kahn will also be answering first this next question. Will you press charges on every police officer who breaks the law? And I'm referring to cases of sexual assault, narcotics, and other felonies.
Yes, and I have. I'm the only candidate who is a federal prosecutor who prosecuted corruptions, and I prosecuted police officers among other public servants who violated their public trust.
Short answer is yes. Obviously, the standards that apply to civilians have to be applied to police as well. So if you're asking me whether I would consider diverting a police officer for a very minor offense, just like I would divert somebody else, well, fair is fair, and being even-handed is being even-handed. But that has not been a problem. Our problem has been a U.S. Attorney's Office and a DA's office who have not stepped up for decades.
Thank you. My next rapid response question is, as part of his campaign promises, our current mayor vowed to put an end to stop and frisk. As you may or may not know, he later changed his position. Will you, as district attorney, file charges against a person whose arrest is based on the use of an illegal stop and frisk? And let's hear from Larry Krasner first.
Answer is no. The DA swears an oath to uphold the Constitution and to seek justice. You can't. It's unethical to pursue charges where there's been an illegal search.
Joe Kahn, yeah, the answer is no, you don't, and this is how I conducted my career for 16 years. But sometimes you don't know, and when you find out that the evidence was obtained illegally, then you dismiss the case after there was an arrest.
Thank you. This is another yes or no question. To combat implicit bias and, frankly, institutionalized racism in your office, will you personally commit and require all of your assistant district attorneys to take yearly implicit bias or institutionalized racism training and assessments? Let's start with Joe Kahn.
Yes.
Yes, but I think the first thing you do on day one is you permit a study of the office to find out what sort of institutionalized racism is going on, and then you use the results of that study to formulate your training.
Thank you. And this is my last rapid response question before we get back into two more longer responses. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office has been incredibly influential in shaping the local and national conversation around the case of political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal. Would you be in favor of a fair retrial for Mumia? And if not, please tell us why. Let's start with Joe Kahn.
Yeah, Joe Kahn. This question's come up with this case and other cases, and I cannot speak about individual cases that I might review as a district attorney because my impartiality could be questioned later of having prejudged a case, and so I will continue to apply that standard.
Joe and I are completely in agreement on this. The only thing that an answer would do here is disqualify me as district attorney from being able to do that. Obviously, I am in favor of fair trials, as any prosecutor should be.
So are you saying that you are unable to comment on the specific case of Mumia at all? I just want to be clear that I can't ask a further question.
I am saying, well, I mean, can I say the name Mumia Abu-Jamal? Yes, I can say that.
Right, I mean, comment on.
Commenting on it is walking into a minefield of disqualification.
Okay.
And I would think that whatever district attorney gets elected should be left in a position to make a fair determination.
Gotcha. I tried.
I agree.
Okay. So the next question that I'm going to ask you, and you'll have 90 seconds to respond to it. So the question gets at the fact that policing in Philadelphia, the entire justice system in Philadelphia, there's an extremely low level of trust between the community and agents of the criminal justice system. For instance, just this morning, in the wee hours of the morning, for those of you who came late, there was an officer-involved killing in West Philadelphia. We do not have a lot of details, but we know that a 51-year-old man was to be served a warrant, and he is now no longer with us. In addition to that, we know that Philadelphia has been found to have a disproportionate number of unconstitutional stop and frisks. So these all contribute to an environment that you will be entering into in which people have very little confidence that the office of the district attorney will take action to punish officers when they do us harm as citizens. So given the fact that as the district attorney, you're an official who is elected to protect all of us, this question gets at your vision, but also the ideas that you have to improve this current dismal situation. So my question to you, are you willing to take on the Fraternal Order of Police and other police associations when police officers have violated the rights of the community? And what tangible policies, and I really would like you to speak about tangible policies, what tangible policies would you put in place to improve accountability? Let's start with Larry Krasner.
Been taking on the FOP a very long time. Over 75 civil rights lawsuits against police officers when I believed that there had been constitutional violations. There had been convictions based upon lying, cheating, and stealing. There had been physical abuse or even killings that were not justified. So I've been doing that for 25 years. And frankly, I think it'll mean a lot to have a district attorney who has been doing that for 25 years. I think it breeds a level of trust, and it builds bridges when you have a district attorney who has represented activists from Black Lives Matter and has represented activists from ACT UP and has represented a lot of black clergy who have been in Heeding God's Call trying to end gun violence. It's a different thing to have a district attorney who has not been a part of the problem and working in this DA's office and working in the U.S. Attorney's office, which frankly is even more draconian than this DA's office. I think that will mean a whole lot. In terms of tangible policies, you dig in on stop and frisk, and where stop and frisk is illegal stop and frisk, you refuse to bring those cases, okay? In terms of tangible policies, you bring in the right people to be in a separate unit that deals with police abuse and police corruption, and you keep those folks away from handling other cases in which they have to cozy up with police. And that means under the supervision of someone with the background and the knowledge, you can actually, in an even-handed and independent way, go after police abuse, thereby reconciling this tremendous divide that we have between people of color and law enforcement in Philadelphia.
Joe Kahn. So first of all, in terms of dealing with the FOP, I've done this. I've spoken to the FOP and told them very clearly that things are going to be different when I'm district attorney. I am still the only, we're talking about specific policies, I am the only candidate who is calling for this independent review, which is so important to make sure that we have a process for dealing with police corruption and police misconduct, which I have prosecuted before, to make sure that we have a process that's fair. So how do we do this? Well, we can go to outside prosecutors, people who are interested in justice, not rubber stamping bad actions. We did this at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We didn't wait till things got so bad that we actually saw a police misconduct. We identified these problems early. In every single case where we worked with a Philadelphia police officer, on my cases, I pulled the internal affairs jacket on every single police officer, and if I saw an issue, if I saw a problem, if when I met with that officer, I didn't trust that officer, we flagged it, we kept a caution list, we kept track. If we saw that there was a stop that was unconstitutional, a stop and frisk that violated the law, we didn't just brush it under the rug. We kept track of it. We spoke up. All of these indictments, they weren't draconian. This was holding police officers accountable. All of these indictments you've heard about corrupt cops, they came from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The U.S. Attorney's Office, when I was there, in my cases, was not about having draconian solutions. I don't believe in giving police officers diversion. If a police officer commits perjury, I don't think that that officer should be held to the same standard as an everyday citizen. That officer should be held to a higher standard. They have violated a public trust. That is the reason that I committed myself to rooting out corruption as a federal prosecutor, and I will do exactly the same thing as your next district attorney.
Thank you. So this is my last question, and then we will open it up to the audience. And you will have 3 minutes each to respond to my question. During the race, this race I should say, most candidates for the office of the district attorney have asserted their support for progressive stances and reforms, such as ending the use of cash bail, opposing the death penalty, or ending use of stop and frisk. In fact, you all sound very similarly, frankly, on some of these issues. So, in an effort to help us distinguish the differences among you, can you highlight how you have actually, and by actually I mean tangibly, worked to advance these causes in your career so far? In other words, what are the things that you can point to in your record that can support the assertion that the campaign promises that you are giving us won't be discarded after you're elected? So let's start with Larry Krasner.
Well, simply put, it's 30 years of being a criminal defense attorney, first as a county public defender, then as a federal public defender, 25 years of founding my own law firm representing individuals who were overwhelmingly poor, both as criminal defendants and also in civil rights lawsuits. That's something. We also have the fact that for 25 years I've been representing activists, and I've been doing it for free, and I've been doing it when it was unpopular and it was unpaid. It is a very, very, very long record of standing up against the death penalty, 30 years in fact. And Mr. Khan, whom I respect a great deal, who's sitting next to me, is not opposed to the death penalty. He's said that over and over. He likes moratoriums, but he doesn't want to take it out of the toolbox. He doesn't want to take it off the table. It's a whole lot of talking around this. He will pursue the death penalty when he thinks it's appropriate. I will never pursue the death penalty. I view that as being a pretty significant difference. When we look at mass incarceration, well, who represented Decarcerate, the group that was going against mass incarceration years ago, before it was this popular? When you talk about issues surrounding illegal search and seizure and corruption and so on, I mean, we got a record here of 75 plus civil rights lawsuits. I'm currently the lead attorney supervising 20 law firms over hundreds of lawsuits having to do with police corruption that the U.S. Attorney's Office addressed, but in which they failed, once again, to get a conviction, all right? It's a record. It's a real record.
Joe Kahn, what we're calling progressive reforms in terms of what the district attorney's office needs to do, in my career, we called these things that we did, that I did, doing the right thing. So when we talk about fixing our bail system, making sure that no one sits in jail because they're poor, that is what I did every day when I showed up to work. There's no reason this has to be difficult. It blows my mind that we still have this broken system here in Philadelphia. When we talk about using forfeiture in an appropriate way, making sure that we obtain convictions, right, before we seize property, especially in cases where we're not talking about, you know, drug kingpins, we're talking about a firearm or a computer, and only using civil forfeiture to freeze assets in big white-collar cases to preserve restitution for victims. When we're talking about having a commitment for prosecutors to recognize that we want to invest in the re-entry of returning citizens, we're calling that progressive now. When I first became a prosecutor, we called ourselves liberals, right? And now we're using the word progressive. I don't care what the label is. The question is, are we going to have a district attorney's office that is going to commit to doing the right thing at all times? And these reforms aren't just things that I did, that I had as part of my job as I understood my mission as a public servant, as a prosecutor. These are things that are the reason that I'm running. Many of you remember I was the only candidate who was willing to run against the current DA when it looked like he was going to get reelected back in September. I left my job, I quit my job to do this, to put myself forward, and I've made these issues a centerpiece of my campaign from the beginning. Thank you.
So I would like to thank the candidates for their responses so far. We have about 15 minutes for audience questions and answers, so this is how this is going to work, okay? So we have one person who we've already flagged to give us the opening question. And if you would like to answer, or if you would like to ask a question, we're going to ask if you are able to come line up in this row here. If you are unable to, please raise your hand and we will come to you. But while we are having our first person ask the question, would you come up? Yeah, in the other row. So you'll have 30 seconds to ask your question and then a minute to respond from the candidates.
Hello. What have each of you personally done to examine how race and misogyny intersect, especially under a white supremacist and capitalist system, and how has that shaped your professional decision making?
So the intersections of racism, misogyny, and our criminal justice system are things that, I obviously, even as a law student studying these issues, and many of you know, I studied under Barack Obama. The way I met him was learning about race in the criminal justice system in his seminar the first time I got to know him. But these are issues that I not only was interested in as a student. When I went to the district attorney's office, the reason I went there was to be an advocate for victims of sexual violence. And there's no more extreme example of misogyny than rape, right? Which is about violence, which is about domination. And what we saw time and time again is so often the victims in our cases, of sexual assault cases, of child abuse cases, were victims who were picked because their attackers thought they could get away with it, right? They perceived them as vulnerable. And disproportionately, especially in child abuse cases, our victims were children of color, women of color. And we're seeing this happening right now, right? I prosecuted hate crimes at the district attorney's office. They happened, with some frequency. After Donald Trump was elected, we saw an explosion of hate crimes. And it's not a coincidence that the people of color, the Muslims who are being attacked, right, immigrants who are being attacked, are disproportionately women, right? It's being done because the attackers think they can get away with it. They think that there will be no justice, and they think that the system will enable them, will reward them. That if they are caught and prosecuted, they will get off. And that was why I dedicated my career to doing everything we could. And sometimes we lost those fights. But I never ducked a fight. I never failed to stand up and try and provide a voice for those who needed a voice and a champion.
So the question I heard, this is Larry Krasner, was about race and misogyny. It's a long answer if I could give it, but the fact is I was counsel to Katrina Northern, an African-American woman firefighter discriminated against and fired almost immediately upon being reassigned to an all-male and almost all-white fire station, represented her successfully. I represented Maritza Mojica and another Latina corrections officer in Philadelphia, both of whom were sexually harassed on the job, did so successfully. I am currently representing a rape victim who needed to find a way to freeze the perpetrator's activity to sell his assets so that the funds, instead of being dissipated throughout his family, could actually be put into a fund for the treatment that she would need. And I'm also currently representing two little girls whose mother was run over by a drunk driver. I have repeatedly represented victims during my career. They were overwhelmingly women, and they were overwhelmingly women of color. For example, a woman who worked at a local university had a love affair with a man. It broke off, but he wouldn't break off. And he continued to send pornographic snail mail that would be opened by other people in the office, full of racial expletives, et cetera, et cetera. She knew that this DA's office was not going to get her justice because the man she had an affair with was close to some judges and was political. And this is, in fact, a very political DA's office. And so she hired me to go with her to court and to be in a position to broker a situation where she would get justice, and she got it. So those are a few of many, many, many examples I could give. Thank you.
So I'd like to ask that the people asking questions say their name and the part of the city that they're from for our broadcasting audience.
How you doing? My name is Robert Jackson. I'm from Southwest Philadelphia. First of all, it's a pleasure to see both of you guys here attending. And everyone gives the black community everything that we want to hear while you're running. And when you get in office, we lose you guys, just like with Seth. So my question to you is, what's going to keep you from the cronyism? And how about putting back programs into the prison system so when these guys come home, they come home with trades again?
Larry Krasner, please.
Joe Kahn, thanks for your question. The first question, first of all, hold me accountable, throw me out if I don't live up to my promises. But beyond that, look at who I am, look at my record. This wasn't an easy thing to do this. I didn't want to have a DA's office in crisis. I didn't want to have my kids in a city where we have a system that is unfair. I want them to grow up in a city that's safe and fair. I'm doing this because I've dedicated my entire career to justice. We're running a deficit. I'm not drawing an income right now. I am not interested in gifts. Nobody's got to put a roof on my house. I don't want to be, taken to Key West. People who have known me my entire career, defense attorneys, know they can't buy me a cup of coffee, right, if they have a case with me. I'm not interested in any of that stuff. The other part of your question, I'm sorry, was about people coming out of prison. And this is exactly what we focused on at the U.S. Attorney's Office in our reentry program. And we need to have focused, dedicated reentry programs. So, for example, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we dealt with young men who had gone to jail for violent offenses, gun crimes. But we need to have as many populations reached as possible. Maybe we have a reentry program that focuses on people who were sent to jail when they were juveniles and now coming out as adults for the first time. Being focused, if we have vision and planning and creativity and dedication, that's the way to be thoughtful about this. And we were successful at the federal level by being collaborative, having everyone work together. There's no reason we can't do that as DA. And the reason I'm going to be able to do it is because I have so many defense attorneys and probation officers and judges who support me, who understand my integrity and my commitment to this work. Thank you.
Okay, just, as long as we're being factual, that reentry program was started by my ex-law partner. It was not started by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the mentor program in the state court system is run by my wife, the Honorable Lisa Rao, and Judge Erdos. I'm not sure why the U.S. Attorney's Office is taking credit for that. However, your question is this all just a bunch of words, right? Are you just talking to talk? Right. Well, all right. So let me just suggest that Michael Court has a point, and Michael Court has endorsed me. Michael Court has said, don't tell me what you're going to do for me, show me what you've done, all right? My record speaks for itself, but there's another level here, which is, listen to this. Arlen Specter, he wants to be a DA kind of young, about 35 or so. Ed Rendell, he wanted to be a kind of young, about 35 or so. Lynn Abraham, she wants to be everything. She still wants to be something. Can't help herself. Seth Williams, here's another guy, about 40 years old. He wants to be governor. He wants to be president. He wants to be king of all presidents. Well, there can be a problem with youthful ambition and with people who at a certain age view the district attorney's office as a step to the next place. Because what they do is they kiss up to the FOP so they can run statewide. And that has happened with every one of these folks. I suggest you might want someone a little older, House 56. And you... And you might want someone who doesn't want to run for anything else, and you might want someone who, from the very beginning of his campaign, unlike every other candidate, said, I will not accept an endorsement from the FOP. That might be a good start.
Hi, I'm Lucy Duncan. I live in Mount Airy. My question is, white supremacy is recalcitrant and you're entering an office that is an agent of white supremacy. And there's the FOP, and you're going to be working with prosecutors that are deep in that system. And there's going to be so much kickback. And how are you going to really work for transformational change in that system that's set up to perpetuate lots of evil?
Step one is you bring in the outside study from right away. Step two is you have a DA who comes in who, whose presence makes it that a certain portion of the old guard chooses to leave. And a couple of them who need to leave are made to leave. And this is what has happened nationally when you get truly progressive DAs in, is that a certain number of people have left and a certain number of other people have been made to leave because you cannot, you just can't change things unless you're willing to change the personnel. Seth Williams failed to change the personnel, and that has something to do with his other failures. When that happens, you're going to have people of my generation and people who look a little bit like me. And they're going to be the ones who are more likely to leave, but you're simultaneously going to have a huge magnet for talent from all over the country. Mid-career people, people coming out of law schools, people coming out of law schools from all over the country who are going to want to be here. And that means you're going to have incredibly talented and extremely diverse candidates who want to come in and be part of that transformational change. It happened with Liz Holtzman in Brooklyn in the early 1970s. It's happening all across the country right now in the 10 important progressive DA wins that have happened since mid-2015, and it will happen here when I'm DA.
So that was Larry Krasner. Now we have Joe Kahn.
So this is something I've been hearing a lot, that at 56, Larry wants to be the kind of progressive prosecutor I was at 26. We have people from across the country who are talented, who are idealistic, who want to serve in the DA's office. And there are good people there. And we hear all this, I alone am the one who can bring this change and invite people that will finally be good and dedicated. We have those people in the district attorney's office right now. They aren't necessarily the supervisors. They aren't necessarily the ones in charge. They don't necessarily have leadership. And, we can point fingers when we make these claims about people that want to do things. You know what my record is. You know that I've dedicated my entire life, my entire career to seeking justice, to being a prosecutor and being the right kind of prosecutor, the kind of prosecutor Larry's talking about. And by the way, I agree with so much of what Larry says. And it's unfortunate that he starts pivoting time and time again at these forums, pointing fingers at me, saying I have some other kind of purpose, I'm too young, I'm too ambitious, when the reality is that what we need are real solutions. We need credibility. And who do you think is going to be more successful at telling the cops, listen, we need to do things a little differently. We're not going to be arresting these low-level drug offenses anymore. Who's going to be more successful at getting them to go along with it? The person who's worked with them for 16 years and has been firm but credible, or someone who's been attacking them for 30 years? Now, I'm not demeaning what Larry's done. Larry's done great work. But in terms of who's likely to be more effective, I stand by my record, and I have stood up to the FOP, and I will do that as district attorney.
Hi. I have, my name is Robert Benjamin Jaffe. How you doing? I live in Northeast Philadelphia, but I also lived in Southwest Philadelphia, right on that corner where there was that police shooting last night. I've lived all over Philadelphia, and I have about 100 questions for you both. I'll ask a very quick one, which is, in terms of your drug policy, you were both talking about that earlier. Do you have an expanded thing on your website that I can go and read about what you were saying? Because I have a lot more questions on both of those. Yes? No? Yes?
I'm not 100% sure of the question. The question is there more detail on drug policy on the website?
Yeah, about specifically, like you were talking about how you wanted to handle it through the courts. And you wanted to send people right to the care facilities. And I really want to know how both of those things would work.
Well, let me just address the question. I can't tell you exactly what's on the website right now, to be honest. I don't pay that much attention to it. It evolves over time and things are added. But I can tell you this. I have not said I just want to deal with drugs through the court. I never said that. What I have said is that there are many different forms of diversion, but it is naive to think that you simply tell a heroin addict, go get treatment and we'll drop the case and this will necessarily end it. It may end it for some of them, but for the ones for whom it does not end, You then have the ability, if you actually want to help people, if you want to help their families, which are in despair because of this addiction, if you want to help people who are dying twice as frequently as homicide victims are being killed, you have the ability to put them into the court system when diverting outside of the court system has failed, and then use that pressure to get them into treatment. My point is ultimately, and I didn't want to say this because it doesn't help, but it's an idle threat. But the point is sometimes you need a threat to help people who are suffering from the disease that is addiction. That's what I was saying.
And it is on my website. When I called for an end to the prosecution of lowest level drug offenses, we put it out in a press release that detailed why I want to do this. I cited the example in Seattle where they've been doing this. And again, since then, we've seen 2 districts in Philadelphia trying it. And I think it's important to try it and see if it works, because we want to do this the right way. Right? We want to make sure we have treatment facilities. And we just have a disagreement. I've been in these courtrooms, right, when you're in court and someone is on probation because there have been countless efforts to rehabilitate them, and they can't beat the habit. And what do? You've got a probation officer, you've got a judge, and the judge doesn't want to send the message that you can keep violating probation without a consequence, because otherwise the threats will be idle. I don't think from the addict's side of things, and this is just a difference of opinion, from the addict side of things, I don't think this should be a criminal justice issue. I think this should be treated as a public health issue. We can still prosecute dealers. In fact, I think we should be taking on bigger fights. We should be prosecuting doctors who overprescribe opioids in violation of the law that are contributing to this problem. That's the kind of work that the U.S. Attorney's Office did. And I don't think that we should prosecute the addicts. I understand the intention. I don't think it's been working. And we have decades of evidence to support that.
I just can't let that go. That is about the second effort to misrepresent what I said. I've never said that they should be convicted and be on probation. You're just trying to make it sound like that's what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying is you don't give up after you simply ask someone who has something as severe as a heroin addiction. You use the process itself as a way to apply pressure. I've never said that they should be convicted. I've been clear that that's not what I'm saying at all.
P.D. Brown, shout out to WURD 900. My question, I'm living in West Philly right now. That's not important. What I want to ask, right, is do you see racism in jury selections?
Yeah. So I have to tell you, I have seen racism in jury selections, and I have called it out. So I've been a prosecutor. I've seen defense attorneys using racist strikes, and I came to the district attorney's office after there was a scandal, after it came out that an attorney named Jack McMahon, right, who had been in the DA's office and then had been a defense attorney, right, and was using racist strikes as a defense attorney, according to many people that talked about this when it came out, had created a video telling assistant district attorneys that this is how you should pick a jury. Now, not only is that unconstitutional, right, there is a clear law against that. It is stupid. The worst thing you could have as a trial lawyer is a homogenous jury, right? You want diversity. You want as many different opinions as you can have. And it is fundamental that when you pick a jury, if you are a prosecutor, you will not use race as a basis for strikes. That is something that I would never tolerate. We've talked about the many kinds of trainings that need to happen, and we talked about implicit bias training. In terms of jury selection, there's zero tolerance for that kind of behavior. If I'm district attorney and I find out somebody is using race as a basis for striking juries, they're out.
Larry Krasner again. So that's part of the story about racism at the DA's office, but the part that's missing is that video by Jack McMahon, who was a career prosecutor up until a certain point, was part of the training library at the DA's office, okay? This is not a problem of criminal defense attorneys discriminating against jurors to help their frequently of color clients. This is a problem of district attorneys and U.S. attorneys trying to make sure that people of color who are defendants have a racist jury. That's what the problem is, and the challenge is called a Batson challenge. It's something that I've used repeatedly during my career, and there are only 2 candidates in this race, in fact, who have an extremely extensive history of trials. One is Tariq El-Shabazz, who unfortunately is not here, and the other one is myself. So, you know, the reality is that what we're talking about goes on. Yes, there is racism, but the issues we really need to turn to are not the sort of really obvious forms of racism. It's the way, for example, that we have a jury system where you can't serve if you have a 50-year-old misdemeanor conviction, what do you think that does when there's disproportionate convictions among people of color? We need to look at those issues too.
If we're going to reserve a right for rebuttal, I'm not going to let that go because I don't know what Larry's talking about. I was a prosecutor for 16 years. I've tried hundreds of cases. I have tried scores of jury trials, and you can look at my record. I have never once been challenged. I don't know why he's pointing at me saying district attorneys, and you know, this is on radio, so you can't see the pointing, but Larry says these things. He makes these outrageous claims, and he points to me, the only other person who, by the way, showed up for this forum, right? And I reject that completely. You know, he tells these stories. No, he's absolutely right. Those videotapes were part of the DA training before I got there. I had nothing to do with that. I reject fundamentally those kinds of attitudes. And Jack McMahon is a defense attorney who defends cases now in Philadelphia. And those kinds of attitudes, Larry, are part of the problem. And I have a record of standing against that. That is why so many of your colleagues, Larry, support me and want me to be the district attorney of Philadelphia, because they know I am committed to fairness, and I will make sure that we have reform in the criminal justice system that will stick.
I guess we'll see you on Tuesday.
My name's Yvonne. I'm from the Northeast. The candidates will know the name Jimmy Dennis. Jimmy Dennis is a man who served 20 years on death row in Philadelphia for a crime that he did not commit. And I know that you cannot answer what you will do on the case if elected, but why the heck is he still in jail? Why is he still in jail after being exonerated?
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but one of the things you want to do if you're going to become a DA, for example, have to be the one who's going to deal with this enormous number of juvenile resentencings, or deal with Mumia Abu Jamal, or you're going to have to deal with Mr. Dennis. One of the things you want to do is make sure you're in a position to do that. And as much as I would like to be able to say more, the reality is I'm standing here without the full file that is in the district attorney's office, and anything that I would say that would express an opinion on it could become a basis for an attempt to have me removed from the case, especially if you have a truly progressive DA who might be viewed by some as being controversial because change is scary for people. So I think the best thing to do in the interest of being effective in that position is not to answer.
Yeah, Larry's completely right. I would add to this, though, this does, without talking about this case in particular, one of the fundamental changes that needs to happen, and I think we agree about this, and this is something I've been talking about for a very long time in terms of a fundamental change that has to happen, is how that office deals with what we call conviction integrity, right? Not waiting to be pushed by defense attorneys to say, hey, take a look, there's an innocent person. Of course, we need to listen to that, but being proactive, cleaning our own house, and saying, we are going to audit our own cases. We're going to look at every death row case and make sure there's no innocent person sitting on death row, right? Make sure we don't have innocent people sitting in jail, period, right? But that, without talking about this case in particular, needs to be fundamental to the next district attorney coming in.
Hi, my name is Phil. I live in Graduate Hospital. Both of you have talked about evidence of white supremacy in our criminal justice system, evidence that is backed by data and facts. What are 3 quantifiable goals that we can hold you accountable to in 4 years, and how will you achieve them?
So the first, if we're limited to three goals, the first is continuing progress on the end to unconstitutional stop and frisk. So we saw number 1 last week. We saw the report had come out that there had been a reduction in the incidences of illegal stop and frisk. We need to have a target of 0, right? And part of the failure, part of us getting to 0 in the last 2 years of the current administration is that while we have a mayor and a police commissioner who want to work towards that goal, we don't have a district attorney that is a full partner in that effort. So that, I see I'm running out of time. That's number 1. Number 2, we've talked about this before, the idea of implicit bias training. It is critical. The reason, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, the reason why implicit bias training is so important is because assistant district attorneys make decisions based on limited information about who gets charged and who doesn't get charged, whether people are getting charged with a serious felony or a less serious misdemeanor, whether someone should be detained or should be released. These are things where unconscious biases, racist biases can bleed into the system. And I see I'm running out of time. The last thing I think in terms of the exacerbation of racism in our system gets back to this cash bail system. And I want to be judged as to whether or not I am successful in eliminating the current system that we have and having a system that no longer criminalizes race and poverty.
So I think this answer on stop and frisk is actually telling, because what is going on now is there are claims that stop and frisk is fairer or more appropriate than it used to be that are based entirely on whatever story is told in the paperwork that's filled out by police. Really? I mean, seriously. Anybody who's done civil rights know that the police are not above lying in that paperwork. Just because they say they did it the right way might just be that they figured out what's supposed to be the right way, so they write it down. I mean, we need to go deeper than that. Second, so I think we need to go at that and go at that the way civil rights lawyers know how to go at that, which is to see whether the stories are repetitive, whether the stories are not credible. Maybe put up a surveillance camera and see whether the stories are matching what actually occurs at these frequent stop and frisk locations. That's one. Two, you need to do a study of institutional bias, and then you need to show improvement. Number three, in terms of your hiring, you need to be going very directly at improvements in diversity within the office, and I think especially if you have more vacancies to fill, that will be doable.
Hello, my name is Devon. I actually live in Jersey. But my question is related to crime and crime statistics. In regards to a lot of the reform that needs to happen actually needs to happen outside of the DA's office, even though that doesn't really get you off the hook for the reforms that need to be made inside of that office as well. But are you ready to advocate for those reforms even though they are located outside of that office?
May I ask a question about the question? Can you be a little more specific about what you mean by those reforms happening outside the office?
Okay, so a lot of times in low-income areas, there is a level of political neglect that happens at the state level, let's say like the state Senate or the state Congress, where the policies that they enact do not affect those areas, or they're outright hostile to those areas. And you can have people who are advocating, as citizens for the changes that need to be made, but then a lot of the elected officials turn around and they don't really say anything, especially like they don't really support those, they don't really support what they're advocating for. In to help them, I'm sorry. You understand what I'm saying, or?
I think I do.
Yeah.
And if I don't, then you can tell me, and I can try to give you a better answer. I mean, let's get real. A lot of times when a district attorney is running for office, he or she wants to claim that somehow they snap their fingers and they affect crime, and they change it. Well, the reality is that just as in the area of health care, what happens in terms of criminal activity has a lot to do with economics. It has a lot to do with the average age of the population. There are theories that, for example, with homicide, that the decline in homicide may even have something to do with improvements in medicine because more lives are being saved. There are theories that crime rates have a lot to do with the availability or the unavailability of contraception and of abortion. I mean, it's an extremely complex issue that is studied all the time. And the most important thing is really not whether a DA is stamping his or her foot in a court hollering, give me 80 years after the blood is on the ground. The important thing is to stop the blood from being on the ground. An awful lot of that most important work happens completely outside of the DA's office. It happens with activists. It happens with progressive legislators. It happens with all kinds of improvements in society that avoid that.
As an elected official, are you ready to advocate for that? Because honestly, you are as a DA, you'd be in the position to see all of those statistics in aggregate. So it would be you that would be in the best position to advocate for the changes that need to be made. So is that something that you would advocate for from that office?
I view the DA's office as a bully pulpit. It's not just a place to go to try to run for higher office. It's not just a place to go to be a bean counter. It's, and try to figure out your whatever number of convictions. It's a place to go and advocate for justice broadly understood. And if that means advocating the money goes into schools instead of in jails, which I've been doing since the beginning of my campaign, if that means advocating money goes to treatment instead of going to the incarceration of addicted people, then absolutely. It is, of course, bigger than that. Job opportunities are huge. Job training is huge. Keeping people in school, young men in school, so they don't become desperate, that is all huge. But I view that as being part and parcel, that bully pulpit, strategically working in partnerships with legislators. I view that as being part and parcel of the obligation to seek justice. Did I answer that sort of?
Joe Kahn, thanks for your question. I'm going to give you a specific example. Tell me if this answers your question. Where I see the district attorney's ability to influence change, change where you need to change the system itself, as a tremendous opportunity. So one thing that the district attorney's office has had for decades is a legislation unit, right, where the district attorney's office advocates for changes to the law. And the priorities of the district attorney, right, in terms of what legislation they want to see changed, tells you a lot about that DA and where their priorities are. My top priority concerns juvenile justice, and where I think I would not only be a credible but an effective voice, concerns how our juvenile court system is set up. Right now, we see time and time again young people getting charged as adults, right, with serious crimes. I saw this on the other side when I was representing kids being charged with serious crimes. I want to change the law. I want to advocate for a change in the law from raising that age where we give up
on young people from 21 to 25. If we change the game, right, we're no longer going to be stuck in a situation where prosecutors have to argue that the public won't be safe if a kid isn't being supervised when they're 22, 23, 24. If we can get that change in the law, we can keep more kids in the juvenile system if they have to be in the system at all, which means they have a better chance of being rehabilitated, which means they have a better chance of having their records expunged and moving on with their lives.
Howard Emanuel Clay Jr. I'm a member of clergy and live in West Philadelphia. I'm regularly in courtrooms standing with black men who have been arrested and overcharged by the police and the DA's office. I'm concerned that since you're going to be working for us, that instead of us farming out police officer-involved shootings, it's my view that we should count on you as our best attorney to come into court, leave the DA's office, and handle these cases as our best attorney here in this city. I think we would get rid of a lot of the white male supremacy that the other person asked about earlier if we change the evaluation criteria for DAs and made it about going to trial. We do not have a criminal justice system. We have a criminal injustice system because it is the DAs and the judges who pressure us to take plea deals. Rarely do matters go to trial. I'm interested in day one in you publishing the statistics of the number of cases that are going to trial versus plea deals, changing the evaluation and promotion criteria for your DAs, and you yourself coming to court and doing trials and not hiding in the office and evaluating your assistant DAs because you're in court evaluating them. Would you commit to that? Yes.
Okay, so would I commit to going to trial? Heck yeah, I've been doing that for a very long time and I like to do it. Absolutely. I think a big part of the problem that we have with guilty pleas has been a culture of judges and DAs who will offer you X for the guilty plea, but if you go to trial, it's going to be 10X or 5X. It has been a completely coercive, over-the-top system fed by mandatory sentencing and fed by discretionary decisions of district attorneys who have absolutely no problem coercing a plea. Another problem we've had is that judges have tended to punish people simply for exercising their constitutional right to go to trial. And it's It's wrong. I mean, it's always been wrong. Part of this would be solved by having much more extensive diversion where people can take accountability without ending up with a conviction, and therefore they're not going through trials anyway. Because it is the overloaded system that has contributed to district attorneys trying to coerce guilty pleas and to judges trying to coerce guilty pleas by making the punishment so much higher if you simply go to trial, right? In my DA's office, it would not be a reason to ask for more time simply because someone went to trial. In my DA's office, there would not be a punishment for that because it is simply the exercise of your constitutional right. And in my DA's office, the way that you evaluate your DAs would have nothing to do with the number of convictions or whether they're getting it on the highest charge. It would have to do with whether or not they're seeking justice.
Thank you for your question, Reverend. In terms of the coerciveness of guilty pleas and evaluating ADAs, I think Larry and I pretty much agree. So let me add this in terms of the issue about coercion for guilty pleas, because one thing that I think it's important to add in terms of what we need to change in the culture concerns what we call discovery, right? It's the paperwork, the evidence that defendants have a right to, right? And what shouldn't have to happen, which often happens, which I hear about all too often from my friends in the defense bar, is that they receive some paperwork and they realize there's some reference to a photograph or a videotape and they have to ask for it. They haven't received it. And so because that's not happening, because not all the evidence is being turned over right away, when these same young men you're talking about are making the decision about whether or not it's a plea or not, they don't have all the information because we don't have a system in place the way that I had when I was an assistant U.S. attorney to make sure as much as possible we had an open file policy. We would turn things over and make sure people had what they needed so that people understood what the trial would look like. They understood what the evidence was going to be before they made the decision. That's not a system that's in place right now. It's one of the first things that we're going to change when I'm district attorney.
So we have two final questions, and we have about 5 minutes left of broadcasting time on WURD. So I'm going to ask our last two people asking questions to ask a 15-second question maximum, and then we'll give you about 30 seconds to respond, and then we'll just have thank yous, and then we'll be done. So.
Good evening. It was indicated that there was 4, 5, 6 candidates that were invited. Only 2 showed up. As Mr. Krasner had indicated, Mr. Shabazz did not show up. My name is Donald Watson. I'm from North Philadelphia. And Mr. Shabazz, this is from me to you. This forum would have been good for you to be here to show what type of DA you would have been. By you not being here, it may show some indication that maybe those votes that could have went to you may not go to you. You should have been here. Thank you.
Good evening, buenas noches. My name is Anilda Davila. I'm from the Upper Olney area of Philadelphia. I am originally from Puerto Rico. The question does not, I guess, pertain to me because, as you know, Puerto Rican people are citizens of the United States, even though we're still a colony. But the question is about the other immigrants that are in this country. Would you persecute a person whose only crime is to be illegal in this country?
Thank you for your question. The answer is absolutely not. And there's a number of reasons why I give you that answer. The first reason is I am the son of an immigrant. I'm the son of a Muslim immigrant, right? And I know something about what immigrant communities face in this country. I also, number two, we are a district attorney's office, right, that is not responsible for enforcing federal immigration law, right, in the first place. And second of all, we shouldn't lift a finger to help the current immigration policy because it is coming from a place of hatred, of bigotry, of xenophobia, and it is unconstitutional to have laws that are enforced that way. I learned my constitutional law from Barack Obama, and I will not in any way enable Donald Trump's racist immigration agenda as district attorney. The final reason that I will not in any way assist what they are doing and will not share information with ICE, which is what we've seen requests since Donald Trump has become president, and even before then, is because as a career prosecutor, I know that when victims, when witnesses, when anyone fears that contacting the police is going to result in deportation, it makes them not want to speak up, right? It makes us all less safe. And so for all those reasons, as DA, we would have nothing to do with that whatsoever.
We don't have time for that.
This is Larry Krasner. What Mr. Khan is not mentioning is that he actually did prosecute people for illegal entry where there was no other offense, and he prosecuted them for illegal re-entry as a federal prosecutor, and he did it many times. We are getting right back to the issue of talking the talk versus walking the walk. I am a Spanish-speaking attorney. I have represented a very large number of immigrants for many years, and I didn't do that. I didn't do that. So I suggest when you're looking for your next district attorney, don't just look at what they're willing to say during an election cycle, that you should look at exactly what they have done.
Okay. So on that note, I would like us to thank the DA candidates who showed up today, Larry Krasner and Joe Kahn, and also thank them for staying beyond the time that we said we would finish. So thank you for your patience with us. I also want to thank our interpreters for the evening. They are Charity Johnson, Kevin Mundy, and Mike Rogers from the Deaf Hearing Communication Center. Thank you for helping us to make this program as accessible as possible. I would also like to thank the listening audience on WURD and WURD itself for being here, broadcasting so that we can reach as many people as possible. I would also like to thank Witnesses to Hunger for co-sponsoring this event with us. We are Black Lives Matter Philly, and we thank you and urge you to vote on Tuesday. All right, thank you.